There's a lot more happening in Venezuela than meets the eye. Now, the country's leader until recently, Nicolas Maduro, he was captured, flown to the United States in a daring special operations raid. The United States is going to be briefly overseeing the transition of government in Venezuela. American warships, they were moved nearby to the Caribbean, and President Trump is now suggesting similar actions could be used against other countries tied in with the drug trade. But it's fair to ask, what's actually going on? Is this about regime change? Is this about oil or resources? Is it about drugs and stopping the cartels? Well, it's actually all of those, but there's a lot more to it. What we're watching take place on the surface in Venezuela is just the tip of the iceberg. Some of this ties to a war that almost recently took place. This was over oil between Venezuela and Guyana. Some of this goes to the Venezuelan election back in 2018, where the first Trump administration and later even the Biden administration officially recognized the government in exile as the legitimate leadership, and Maduro is the one who stole it. There's the territory battle, as China, Russia, and Iran have built networks that are acting to keep the United States out of the entire region. But to really understand this, we need to go back to what's known as the pink wave. This is when socialist governments swept through Latin America in the late 90s and early 2000s. And ahead of the pink wave, Venezuela was a very different place. Venezuela was one of the top rising economies, the richest country in all of Latin America. It was also one of the most stable democracies in the region and was a close U.S. ally. Most of the economy was in oil. Life for most there was a lot better. But bad spending and rising debt led to a downslide in the early 1980s. It didn't get better for them. And by 1994, the country was hit by a banking crisis. People wanted affordability, and they turned to the guy who was promising that to take from the wealthy and redistribute it to the people. They didn't realize he would take things much, much further and make things a lot worse. Then the crash came, and it was historic. Economics Observatory noted Hugo Chavez implemented exactly the wrong kind of macroeconomic policy during the 2000s and early 2010s when Venezuela's economy was booming due to the global commodity supercycle, a prolonged period of high and rising prices of grain, metal, oil, and gas. And the result of this, well, it especially hit hard when Maduro first came to office in 2013. Now, as the report notes, the collapse was historic. Living standards fell by around 74% between then and 2023. It states this is the fifth largest fall in living standards in modern economic history. And it looked particularly bad for Maduro because, look, the country wasn't even at war. It was just a lot of bad economic decisions. It was socialism, extreme state control over all the workings of the economy, micro and macro, and that heavy-handed approach was devastating. But behind the scenes, something else was taking place. Outside interests, backroom deals with communist states. This started before Chavez, but he made this part of his international strategy, breaking ties with the United States and establishing them instead with Cuba and other communist regimes. Now, according to CNN back in 2019, this was all part of a plan. Fidel Castro in Cuba called it his master trick on the gringos. In fact, those were his words to former Venezuelan President Romulo Betancourt. Now, Castro wanted an oil deal to break Cuba's economic dependence on the United States, and Betancourt refused. It didn't happen, at least not yet. Not until Chavez came into power in 1998. Castro and Chavez, they became very close friends. And this led them to form a brand new communist alliance for Latin America. CNN even stated at the time, Castro would eventually take the role of the elder statesman and Chavez his heir to the mantle of the leader of the Latin American left. Lines between the two countries started to blur. Chavez he even referred to Venezuela and Cuba as one big homeland, the La Gran Patria as he called it. And after the two leaders died, well, they had a replacement lined up. That replacement, handpicked by Hugo Chavez, was Nicolas Maduro. And this is also part of the big power shake that took place. This is where the whole government in exile comes in. Why the United States, under both Trump and Biden, did not regard Maduro as the real leader of Venezuela. Now, on the side of the opposition, Juan Guaido became the leader of the government in transition and officially recognized opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez as president-elect after the 2024 election. Now, the people of Venezuela knew their country was cozying up with Cuba. They knew Chavez had basically imploded the oil industry and the economy. They knew they were losing their country to outside Cuban influence, and that was why many, including Juan Guaido, were warning about this. He had promised to end Cuba's influence over Venezuela. But you see, that's not so easily done, right? Because ending Cuban influence would also affect the influence of others who came in during that time. That was Russia, Iran, and most notably, the Chinese Communist Party. Breaking that alliance would mean bringing in the sliding scale of global relations right back to the United States. And that also ties into a much broader battle for power now taking place behind the scenes over Latin America. Because look, Venezuela had been a model country of sorts for the Monroe Doctrine. That was a U.S. policy that Latin America is the backyard of the United States, and the communist bloc has no business meddling in it. Before Hugo Chavez, that was where Venezuela stood. During the Cold War, the country did not have good relations with the Soviet Union. Venezuela held a pro-Western stance. Communist parties and movements in the country, they were even suppressed. But here's the thing. Chavez did not technically get rid of the Monroe Doctrine. He really couldn't because it's not a law or treaty, and it's in America. It's just a stated U.S. policy going back to 1823. Basically, it declared the New World, the Americas, is off limits to any new colonization or interference from Europe. And that carried into the Cold War. But when Chavez came around, he declared that the U.S. policy was dead. In 2006, at the United Nations General Assembly, Chavez even openly lashed out at the entire American system, claiming the people of Latin America would declare,
Yankee Empire, go home.
And Chavez actually put this into practice. He moved to build a new form of order that pushed out involvement of the United States or Canada. These were the Union of South American Nations, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and Venezuela and Cuba also established the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of our America. And these were all built as direct challenges to the United States to push it out from Latin America. And from that void, other powers were brought in. And Chavez worked to facilitate this. Chavez, he signed over 200 cooperation agreements with Russia. He allowed Iran to open factories and banks in Venezuela. And he also established military and intelligence ties to the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, this included Chavez signing over 400 agreements with the CCP. And after Chavez helped establish the CCP's presence, Venezuela became the testing ground, the pilot programs for the Chinese Communist Party to expand its control using the Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure deals designed with debt traps. And when Chavez died, well, the Chinese Communist Party continued to deepen its foothold using the Belt and Road Initiative model. Venezuela sold out. The CCP's Belt and Road Initiative, it was used to replace the American Monroe Doctrine policies. And Venezuela, what happened? It fell into poverty, crime, and absolute ruin. But this was also part of the broader shift. With the Cuban and Venezuelan network pushing out America, bringing in Russia, Iran, and the CCP, similar far-left leaders to Chavez and Maduro had also been taking hold all throughout Latin America. These included Lula in Brazil. It included Nestor Kirchner in Argentina. It included Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and others elsewhere. And they carried the same basic agenda: reject the American Monroe Doctrine and bring in the Chinese Communist Party's Belt and Road Initiative programs. These were loans and investments designed never to be repayable. And when the countries default, well, what happens? They become deeper and deeper under the control of the CCP. Many of the far-left and communist policies also emerged from somewhere else. After the Berlin Wall fell, the global communist bloc tried to find ways to hold their regimes together. And in Latin America, this took the form of the Foro de Sao Paulo, This was founded in 1990 by Lula in Brazil and Fidel Castro in Cuba. And this established a new communist international for this entire region, bringing together over 100 leftist parties, organizations, and movements, Marxists, socialists, even narco-terrorist organizations, including FARC and the Cartel of the Suns. And it was formed with the same objective that Chavez carried out after working with Castro. It was designed to push out the United States and bring in the election of far-left regimes. And the Chinese Communist Party was fanning the flames. The regime even used its China Development Bank to give billions in loans to pink-tide governments all through this network. It worked to get them funding without conditions from the International Monetary Fund. And this helped new regimes look good to the public as they grew and spread all throughout Latin America. And while the CCP continued pulling them deeper into debt, using this trap system. But the realities of the bad deals were doomed to show themselves. And this came to the forefront of the 2018 Venezuelan elections. Maduro lost, but Maduro refused to step down. Mass protests erupted on the streets in 2019, and Guaido tried to establish an interim government. Maduro then crushed the opposition. He used pro-government militias with alleged ties to the Cartel of the Suns. And all this happened during Trump's first term in office. Trump threatened to even invade Venezuela to reestablish order, to oust Maduro, and to allow for a new transition of power. But Maduro did something at that time. He asked for outside help. Russia made a show of force against the United States. Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela, and Russia also provided arms sales, military advisors, and aid to the Maduro regime. Russia even warned it would stand by Venezuela and U.S. intervention would be catastrophic. And the Chinese Communist Party, well, they also intervened, but mainly on the diplomatic stage. They made calls against any potential U.S. intervention. Maduro stayed in power. The economic problems and the national decline, well, they only got worse. Guaido would later flee to Florida, and Trump, he ended up not intervening. But in 2020, the United States Department of Justice announced criminal charges against Maduro and 14 current and former Venezuelan officials. This included charges for narco-terrorism, for corruption, for drug trafficking, and other crimes. And it even stated that Nicolas Maduro and other Venezuelan officials had partnered with the FARC to use cocaine as a weapon to flood the United States. And years later, when Trump was back in office, well, in July 2025, the U.S. Department of Treasury strengthened the U.S. stance against Maduro. It announced sanctions against the Cartel of the Suns, and it declared it was a global terrorist operation and that Maduro was the leader of that cartel and terrorist group. Now, the terror designation was then even enhanced again, November 2025, with an official announcement from the U.S. Department of State. But this also had some deeper context. Before Maduro was declared the leader of the Cartel of the Suns, before the terror designation, before the American airstrikes, a war was about to break out in South America. Venezuela was preparing to invade Guyana, just to its north. Let's rewind. In 2015, Guyana discovered one of the largest oil reserves in the world, an estimated 700 million barrels recoverable. Now, as you'd expect, many companies are doing oil discoveries there, including Exxon. And in the throes of economic turmoil, what did Maduro do? He wanted this liquid gold. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum, and he claimed voters had overwhelmingly supported a policy to have Venezuela annex the part of Guyana with all that oil. That's Essequibo. And this would also reject an order from the International Court of Justice in that dispute. Now, under the Venezuelan referendum, Maduro declared his plans to deploy his military to Guyana, and then he authorized Venezuelan state-owned companies to exploit the oil and gas there. The declaration was also enhanced by military threats. Venezuela started conducting military exercises on the border of Guyana. The Venezuelan Navy began launching incursions near Guyana's EEZ and also notably near the ExxonMobil oil rigs. War was looming. And in March 2025, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued a warning to Venezuela.
It would be a very bad day for the Venezuelan regime if they were to attack Guyana or attack ExxonMobil or anything like it. It would be a very bad day, a very bad week for them. And it would not end well for them. I'm not going to get into details of what we'll do. We're not big on those kinds of threats. I think everybody understands, and I want it to be clear. We've made this clear repeatedly. I think the U.S. Navy today is making it clear and demonstrating our ability to. We have a big Navy, and it can get almost anywhere. It can get anywhere in the world. We have commitments that exist today with Guyana.
And well, Venezuela didn't listen. And then the airstrikes began. First, on September 2nd, 2025, when President Trump posted a U.S. military video of a strike on a Venezuelan drug boat. And now, well, the situation just reached a major inflection point. After months of preparation and weeks of waiting for the perfect window of opportunity, late in the evening on January 2nd, President Donald Trump finally gave the order for a dramatic operation. U.S. Special Forces were to launch a raid in Caracas, the capital city of Venezuela, to capture Nicolas Maduro. And what followed very quickly in the early morning hours of January 3rd was a complex helicopter-borne raid that resulted in the capture of Maduro and his wife, and the transportation to the United States, where they now await trial in an American courtroom.
All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military, working with U.S. law enforcement, successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night.
So here's why what's happening in Venezuela actually matters. The country was the channel to break regional ties with the United States all throughout Latin America, and to import influence from the alternative world order through Russia, Iran, and the Chinese Communist Party. It used to be that Cuba was the main hold of communism in the region, but because of the bad economy, the lack of military strength, they were limited on what they could do. Venezuela brought them money, and at least in the early years, and between Chavez and Castro and Lula in Brazil, they were able to expand a communist-aligned order funded by drugs and oil that would push the United States out of the entire region. But that order is now collapsing, and it seems the U.S. operations we're now watching, while partly about sanctioning oil and destroying drug networks, is also about rebuilding U.S. influence and presence in Latin America.